And indeed, no, it wasn't very much on the table. It wasn't being discussed. But I mean, I think that's been one of the big problems with this the way this conversation has gone around coronavirus, in that a lot of things have just not been discussed openly, not been debated. I've certainly found it very difficult to put my views out in that, you know, as soon as we wrote that paper, we were met with an avalanche of really quite, serious comments, which not all of which were, I mean, even though they were from scientists, not all of which were...
Even from colleagues of yours?
Yes, which they were really quite harsh. I mean, they dismissed the model and they accused us of being irresponsible because, of course, there's this sort of sense that going into lockdown is this enormously sort of communitarian.
Other comparisons aside, it sounds a little bit like the debate around climate change, actually.
Yes, it is. I think the language.
Some people say some things that's to the effect of this is a big problem, but maybe it's not the end of the world. Then they're accused of being irresponsible, like you say.
Yes, I think the language is very similar. When you talk about climate change deniers and COVID deniers, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, that there's this sense of authority and of virtue that's associated with certain positions, which has taken, I guess, the place of religion.
Oh yes, I saw that you were referring to that in another interview just recently. You had that something to the effect of that the way some people seem to simply not accept that this virus exists really is semi-religious. What do you mean by that?
What you just articulated so well yourself, which is that, you know, that the whole position is of towards us, that some of the criticism is very much couched in terms of us being in denial of this enormous threat that is about to enormous problem that's about to befall mankind, and that the only the only response can be to wear masks and lock down, and the extent that herd immunity has suddenly become this very emotive word. I mean, it's just a technical concept. I mean, why is herd immunity? The herd immunity crowd is seen as alternative.
What do you think this reaction comes now? What do you think this happens now? This extreme reaction to a virus. I mean, we've had so many viruses over the years, and we've had pandemics before. We had the Ebola pandemic, or maybe epidemic, or it was a pandemic. I can't really see.
Well, I suppose. I mean,
and then there was not even the countries, the affected countries in West Africa. They were in lockdown. Not even then. And I mean, Ebola is a really, really serious
it's a really
thing.
Serious.
But now all of a sudden this happens. Like the whole world has gone.
Yes, I don't quite. I mean, it's very interesting how it happened. I mean, if you just look at the history of lockdown and what lockdown means, I mean, because lockdowns, of course, initially, I mean, there's several ways in which you can think about what a lockdown does. And the first thing a lockdown could do is stop a virus from getting out. And that's, I think, quite a reasonable position to take. And as such, I think even in Italy, I mean, certainly in Wuhan, but even in Italy, the initial implementation of lockdown, I felt the language or the rationale seemed to be, we don't want it to get out of Lombardy. We don't want it to affect all of Europe, which is laudable. That's fine. You know, that's a very selfless thing to do. And then it suddenly turned from being that selfless act to being the selfish act, and I will use that word, of locking down to prevent the virus from getting in, which is not you can justify it. I'm not saying, obviously national interest can, countries are founded on the basis of national interest. So you could say, look, I'm going to lock my country down because I'm the prime minister and that's what I owe my people. But if you do that, you should apologize. You shouldn't, uphold it as some sort of virtuous thing you're doing, because what you're doing is you're implementing a policy that only caters to the people within the boundaries of your nation. And what I found very disappointing in all of this is a complete lack of internationalism in the response. So locking down your country to prevent it from getting in, I think, is a very nationalistic way of doing things. And I don't understand why people have, been upheld as sort of paragons of virtue for doing that. And then finally, the third thing with lockdown that people thought was possible was somehow to eliminate the virus. And that's, I think, quite
That's not really possible, is it?
It's just not possible. It's just not even practical.
I see a pattern here. The leaders, the politicians, they act in a way that is designed to look powerful. So they take measures even where none are needed. In essence, it's fear-based. Fear takes many forms. One is polarization, the notion that, we here on our side, we are secure here. And if we just can define the border to the other side, the others well enough, we'll be safe. Another form of fear is to stress that you might lose something. You might lose your money, your health, your national pride, your identity. And when leaders tell us those things and we buy into it, then we act out of that we get stuck in a mindset of crisis and scarcity. And that's no good base for creativity and growth. Goes without saying. But still, they are locking down societies, they are closing schools. What is your explanation for all of this? That they are taking these measures despite the fact that you and so many other scientists and researchers know what's actually happening?
Oh, that's a good question. So back in March, there was a rationale to sort of flatten the curve so as not to overburden the hospitals.
Yeah.
So I think that was a reasonable thing to do, and there was a lot of uncertainties. So to do a limited measures for a few weeks to flatten the curve so that not everybody has to go to the hospital at the same time, I think that was reasonable. But for some reason, that somehow quietly just became a goal to suppress the virus, to suppress the disease, which cannot be done. And there were many of us back in the spring said that you can do it temporarily, but it's just going to come back with a vengeance, which we are seeing now. So what those of us who were sort of arguing against these harsh lockdowns back in the spring, what we were saying has now turned out to be true. But the politicians are just doubling down on the strategy that failed in the spring and trying the same failed strategy again. And
Do you think it's prestige or something?
I'm a simple scientist.
Yeah, so it's difficult for you to know, but
I am actually just stunned, and I don't understand it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, all the pandemic preparedness plans were there, and they were just ignored. And we still have situations in the US where the schools are being closed, to great detriment to children, and of course especially to working class children, because children in more affluent families, they can have a tutor or they can go to private school, or which are open, or do some part schooling and so on. So this is highly detrimental to children, and not just education, but also their physical health, their mental health, and their social development. So the politicians are having the school closed, even though there's absolutely no public health reason to do so. At the same time, they're not concerned about protecting the high-risk older people in nursing home, etc. They're not doing what's needed to do that. And of course, there are exceptions, because in the US, public health is actually not a federal thing. By law, it's the state governors who are in charge. So there's basically 50 different policies. So, for example, Florida is doing well, but New York is a major disaster, for example.
It's really mysterious, isn't it, that the politicians make these decisions despite everything we know.
Yeah, and it's also strange with the journalism. Many of the journalists who I think have sort of been pushing a certain narrative that goes against what I think and what most of my infectious disease epidemiology colleagues think on these matters.
There's a negativity bias in journalism, as you know. There's a if it bleeds, it leads. This classic, mindset. It's sad. I was thinking that these lockdowns, have we ever actually engaged in these kinds of broad lockdowns that we're seeing now? I mean, during earlier pandemics, for sure we haven't. Not even the Asian flu in the 50s or the Hong Kong in the 60s. But has there ever been lockdowns in any circumstance, even World War II? I was thinking about that the other day, and I actually don't think we have done this before. Do you know about this? Are there any other historic examples of these kinds of broad lockdowns where you're not supposed to even go out of your home?
There has been nothing even close to this scale. There is an example from England, and I forgot the name of the village, but I think it was in the 17th century. There was a village that was ravaged by the pest, and they actually self-isolated themselves, not to protect themselves from the outside, but to protect them outside from themselves, so that the pest would not move outside the village and spread further. So it's sort of the opposite purpose in a sense. But that's one nice example, and it was actually successful in the sense that there were, of course, mortality in this village, but it did not spread to other places. So they were actually doing like a self-sacrifice.
So it was a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down, as we are seeing now.
Yeah. So, no, there's not been anything close to this. If you look at the pandemic preparedness plans, they don't talk about lockdowns.
No.
And so it's a huge experiment, and it's a terrible experiment because of all the collateral damage. And we don't yet know what the numbers are, but the final numbers are, because it will take time before we know the cancer deaths, for example, the extra cancer deaths caused by the lockdown.
The true nature of COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2 as the virus is called, has so far eluded the medical and epidemiological expertise. How does it operate? How contagious is it? How lethal is it? How does it affect humans? In the beginning, it seems like years, but it's just a few months ago, there were countless more or less fantastical accounts about the devilishness of this unseen submicroscopic infectious agent. The paper that probably had the largest impact was a now infamous study from Imperial College in London. It affected national policies in both the UK and the United States. The study made dramatic assumptions about how many would die if communities weren't locked down. These calculations showed to be completely off the track, which epidemiologist Sunetra Gupta made very clear in her talk with Mind the Shift back in July. However, debunking that study didn't seem to have much effect on policies either. Some weeks later, a fierce debate took off about the pros and cons of wearing face masks, a debate which is still ongoing. So why do you think these sweeping measures happened this time around and never before? Why do you think this happened?
Because China started.
You think so?
Yeah.
Explain, elaborate.
No, they contained it, and they were very quick and showing. And I think to go against what the Chinese did, I think it would have been very difficult for a lot of countries. So I think they showed this is possible to do.
But did we know that in March?
Well, we saw what they did, and then I think they did it very early. And from our point, it came much later here, and it had, I think, more in that sense, more severe effects. But I remember watching a documentary, I think it must have been in March, from where they welded together doors in China. So they did it very strongly. And I think, so from the politician side point of view, and I think that's really where we've had the discussion there. Our chief epidemiologist has said that everybody went crazy because, these type of measures that had never been used before suddenly were being implemented. And that would be my take home from it, that we
So they were impressed by China?
Well, they saw no other type of, they wanted to do something, and I think the politicians has to show, and I think that's what the Swedish so-called model has been criticized for, is that it's not been very prompt and very, authoritarian, and here what everybody wanted was to have clear message of what to do. And you could even see in a country like France, where you normally have people protest and challenge. They were totally quiet. There was nobody challenging that lockdown in France, because people were afraid.
People
and
were
they
afraid.
thought this
People
is probably
scared,
the correct thing to do.
Easy to control a people that's scared.
Yes. And we've seen that. I mean, now there are opportunities to control a population using this type of fears. So I think that's a bit of a scary part of this.
We have to be a bit careful, perhaps, to see where this goes.
Because you can justify this type of measures by saying we're
and now you can politicians can prolong them and say that, well, we don't know, we're not sure, there's a mutation going on here, so we just keep it like this for another 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. When will it ever end?
No.
I mean, it's...
No, and I think especially in a lot of countries where we've seen riots of political reasons, this is one way of saying controlling them, and there's a number of countries like that where the COVID, the lockdown has been used to stop protests. We saw that also in Lebanon, because there was a lot of protests after the blast, and then the lockdowns came, and so there's a lot of tension, you can say, and then it's difficult, of course, to be the one breaking a curfew or a lockdown with protests, because then you can be held accountable for spreading the disease.
I kind of started thinking maybe this is something that they have introduced now, many politicians, thankfully not in Sweden as yet, but in most other countries, and that is going to be pretty hard for those decision makers to undo it, to quit this mandatory face mask use, because it's always, of course, easy to say for people in charge that, we're not really rid of the risks yet. There's still a risk. And then I came to think of another mandatory thing that we have really gotten used to, and it's been so long now with it we don't even think of it, hardly. Anyway. Has also to do with travel, and I'm thinking about what happened in the aftermath of 9/11. The liquid restrictions, I mean, there were immediately a lot of much harsher security measures on the airports, but then a few years later, 2006, they introduced this liquid restriction, and why 100 milliliters? No one really knows. It seems just like a random figure. And it all started when there was a bomb plot against Heathrow, where the perpetrators supposedly planned to detonate bombs on planes by way of mixing liquids that they would smuggle onto the planes in bottles of soda. So that's how it all started. And that was in 2006, and it was a temporary measure. It was supposed to be in place for 18 months, they said. And now it's been 14 years, and it's still there. We can get used to anything, really. Now let's hope that this face mask thing is not something of the same kind, something that we get used to and never stop wearing.